Oh, you're still around. Hey, great. Let's return to how MUFON currently establishes certainty in a UFO or ET claim or report. First is a quality index that documents essentially the time and extent to which data was gathered from a reporter and the sources of information. The more sources and the more time spent on the case increases the quality. Second is a reliability index, which looks at the characteristics of the witnesses. The more witnesses, the more education they have. The breadth of sources from which evidence was collected, the higher the reliability. The more corroboration, the more reliable your report. Finally, the strangeness index. This one sees the more unusual, out of the norm, anomalous, the more unexplainable the event was to an ordinary person, the greater likelihood something happened. In other words, the less your experience could be confused with an airplane, weather balloon, or swamp gas, the greater the chance what you saw must have been something otherworldly. Multiply these three indexes together, and that gives you a score of the certainty of your report. Now, I am not a trained field investigator, despite all attempts by John, Dave, and Kyle for me to send away for a study kit, but here's what I see. I see the Ballister Guasp Report Evaluator in MUFON to be an excellent way to capture a decent measure of the certainty of a UFO ET event, with quality, reliability, and strangeness included. But I also see it has the potential to leave out half the picture. Now, I've read enough case reports during our meetings to know that the credibility of the witness and their motivation is important in the upper left. I've also seen enough reports to know that the certainty of a story can be called into question based on the background of the reporter in the lower left. For example, from a subjective point of view, are the claimants part of a college group of buddies trying to pull off a hoax of the century to see what they can get on CNN and how viral they can get a video post on YouTube? I know it's important, and every field investigator keeps in mind these potential contaminants to a case. My point is that it is not deliberate. The biography and background of a reporter is treated as an afterthought, or certainly a cautionary instruction to be aware of these variables to avoid being duped into a hoax. But it's not explicitly stated, and I argue that it should be. Here's what I'm proposing. This is one of 3 grids or rubrics I proposed in one of my 4 white papers outlining the approach of integral ufology. As a reminder, these white papers, as well as discussions on how this integral ufology approach was developed, are available on the website www.omahaufostudygroup.com. I attempt to give equal weight to each of these 4 perspectives in integral theory by listing them on the left: subjective, objective, cultural, and social. I try to incorporate elements from the Ballister Guasp Evaluator, except for the strangeness index, which I should have included somewhere on the objective line. Not sure where to put strangeness. That might be something subjective, but it is equally objective. If it's outside your typical subjective and cultural experience, then that should have some weight. What I want you to see is how a score of all ones, suspicious motivation of the reporter, a low quality index, presence of cultural influences, and a low reliability index would allow us to dismiss a case like this much more easily with a score of 1, 2, 3, 4. On the opposite end, however, a score of all 3s, that is, no suspicions about the reporter, a high quality index, no apparent cultural influences, and a high reliability index, should put a report like this to the top of the pile with a score of 12. With a scale of 3 to 12, we could be a lot more confident we're not missing something. I created a similar rubric addressing close encounters of the second kind, which is, for those who don't remember, only means there's some kind of physical trace evidence beyond just a sighting or lights in the sky. Look at column 1. If a report has inconsistencies or story changes from the reporter, little trace evidence, a clear potential for influence by family and friends or the media, and no corroborating witnesses, this would lead most of us to set such a report aside and spend less time on it. But look at column 3. No changes or inconsistency in the reporter's story over time, measurable or demonstrable trace evidence, no apparent or at least justifiable cultural influences, and corroboration by a bunch of other witnesses. This should cause us to spend much more time on a case like this. I've attempted to do the same thing with close encounters of the third kind, but this can get very tricky because we don't have the technology yet to address reports that are almost exclusively subjective. Direct encounters with an entity or abduction scenarios, as far as I have understood, typically involve ASCs, or altered states of consciousness. Was the reporter asleep? Were they dreaming? Were they in a twilight state between waking and dreaming? Could it be described as an out-of-body experience where the person felt completely awake and yet confronted with images that seem more dreamlike? Here, I put the score from 1 equals ASC to mean less valid or prone to fabrication, to a score of 3 as being fully awake within an ASC, in such a way that the experience could be seen as more valid and potentially less confused with a personal subconscious state of awareness. In other words, a lucid or vivid ASC would get more weight in the system. On the objective, perhaps the Blecher subtypes cannot be scaled in this system. The Blecher subtypes are things along the lines of entities. Are they observed inside inside a UFO, outside a UFO, without a UFO around, or receiving some kind of intelligent communication, as in type F? But they can be listed here among potentially verifiable trace evidence that corresponds to such an encounter. Finally, my best stab at validating the social perspective is to look at the urgency with which the contactee felt the need to communicate such an otherworldly or disturbing experience. The more the better is what I was thinking, but in any case, the reporter should have a darn good reason why they didn't make an effort to share it, such as fear or ridicule or damage to their career or reputation. Anyway, there you have it. Integral ufology is evaluating a case from subjective, objective, cultural, and social perspectives, or self, culture, and nature. But wait, in case you thought I'd be done early, as I first looked at this approach, which seemed to take everything into account, I was reminded of a 19th century German philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, who said of materialism that it is a philosophy of the subject who forgets to take account of himself. What that means to the approach of integral ufology is that as long as we're taking such great pains to get a complete picture of the reporter and their story, what about you? That is, what about the field investigator themselves? What about the person evaluating and interviewing all the witnesses? Or what about you sitting there trying to figure out what to believe and what not to believe? Don't you and I, as inquiring minds, need to take account of our own biography and our own background before rendering an opinion on whether we believe it or not? As you are sitting at home in your armchair all by yourself, how should you take account of you, the investigator, and your ability to contaminate the report? Oh no, you say, not more. Yes, we have to take into account the background, training, knowledge, opinions, and prejudices of the person doing an evaluation, don't we? You already do it, don't you? You have to decide whether any story is believable or credible. You have a set of glasses you're peering through as you try to discover the truth. Well, so does everybody else. This is why I believe a complete approach to integral ufology should include not just 2 perspectives and not just 4, but yes, stay tuned.